The hum of the bustling airport terminal buzzed like an unrelenting hive. Gate B27, usually just another stop in the grand choreography of arrivals and departures, felt different today. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and overpriced coffee. A strange contrast to the crisp scent of the brand new airline uniform Victor Reynolds had reluctantly put on that morning. A disguise. A test. One that he knew could redefine everything. Victor adjusted his tie, his fingers grazing the gold-trimmed wings pinned to his chest. To the world, he was just another business-class passenger, a well-dressed traveler heading to Los Angeles. But in reality, he was the CEO of Skylux Airlines, the very company that operated this flight. The airline had been his father's legacy, and now it was his. But something had been nagging him for months. Anonymous complaints about the treatment of passengers, particularly those from diverse backgrounds. The reports were vague but troubling, whispers of racial bias lurking beneath polished smiles. He had to see it for himself. The boarding process was already underway. An orderly chaos of rolling suitcases and murmured goodbyes. Victor moved towards the jet bridge, his keen eyes scanning the cabin crew. They were young, polished, and efficient, greeting passengers with perfect corporate smiles. But as he stepped into first class, something shifted. A tall blonde flight attendant, her name tag reading Monica, glanced at him, her smile flickering for half a second before she turned back to her colleague. The smallest of hesitations. But Victor had spent years reading people. He caught the quick exchange between her and the redhead beside her. Lauren, according to her badge. A look, a whisper, a barely perceptible change in tone when she greeted the next passenger, a well-dressed white man right behind him. Victor's stomach tightened. He forced a neutral expression, nodding politely as Monica gestured to his seat. "Right this way, sir," she said smoothly, but something about her tone felt off. It wasn't outright disrespect, just a shade of coldness, the kind that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Settling into his seat, Victor observed the passengers around him. An elderly couple flipped through the in-flight magazine. A middle-aged man barked into his phone. And across the aisle, a young black woman in a navy blue pantsuit quietly adjusted her carry-on. She looked professional, successful. Yet when Monica approached her, Victor saw it again. The smile was thinner, the voice tighter. "Ma'am, I just want to remind you that these overhead bins are reserved for first-class passengers," Monica said, her words edged with unnecessary sharpness. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "I am in first class." Monica hesitated. Then, with a smile too saccharine to be genuine, she replied, "Oh, of course. My apologies." Victor's pulse quickened. It was subtle, calculated, but there. Minutes later, as the cabin door closed and the flight crew prepared for takeoff, Victor noticed Monica and Lauren whispering again near the galley. Their eyes flicked towards him, just briefly, before Lauren let out a quiet chuckle. He clenched his jaw. It was happening, right in front of him. Then, just as the plane began taxiing down the runway, Monica returned to his row. Leaning down, slightly, she lowered her voice and said, "Sir, I just wanted to check. Are you certain you're in the right seat?" Victor met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said evenly, though inside, his chest burned with quiet anger. She hesitated, lips parting as if she wanted to say something else. Then, with a tight smile, she stepped back. Victor exhaled slowly. This flight was going to be revealing. Victor sat stiffly in his plush first-class seat, staring straight ahead, but his mind was miles away. The hum of the engines and the murmur of flight attendants preparing for service faded into the background. He could still hear Monica's words. "Are you certain you're in the right seat?" They echoed in his mind, not because of the words themselves, but because of the weight behind them, the implication, the assumption. He had seen this before. Years ago, before he had taken over as CEO of Skylux Airlines, Victor had been just another ambitious young black man trying to prove himself in an industry that barely saw him. He still remembered the early days when he was an intern at an aviation consulting firm, fresh out of business school, brimming with ideas and drive. He had worked twice as hard, stayed later than anyone else, and yet, when it came time for promotions, his name was always an afterthought. You've got to work smarter, not just harder. His father had told him one night when he came home frustrated, and sometimes that means playing the long game. Let them underestimate you. It only makes your success more satisfying. His father, the legendary Raymond Reynolds, had built Skylux Airlines from the ground up, turning a struggling regional carrier into a respected global brand. Victor had idolized him, but he had also seen the battles his father had fought. The side eyes from board members, the condescending tones from so-called colleagues. They had smiled in his face and doubted him behind closed doors. And now, even after Victor had taken the helm, those same attitudes still lingered like a stain on the industry. Which was why he was here. Victor shifted slightly in his seat as Lauren, the red-headed flight attendant, approached with a tray of drinks. Her bright smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Champagne or orange juice?" she asked. "Champagne, please," he said smoothly. Lauren handed him the glass, but as she did, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for him to fumble. When he didn't, she straightened and turned to the other passengers without another word. Victor exhaled, gripping the stem of his glass a little tighter. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't obvious. But he could feel it. The unspoken question of whether he truly belonged here. Across the aisle, the young black woman in the navy pantsuit, who had already been questioned about her seat, had taken out a laptop and was typing away. Victor stole another glance at her, and she caught his eye. There was a moment of silent understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement. She had felt it too. After a brief pause, she leaned over slightly and whispered, "Guess it's going to be that kind of flight." Victor gave a slow nod. "Seems like it." "I'm Maya," she said, offering a small smile. "Victor." She glanced at his attire, taking in the crisp suit, the understated watch, the air of quiet authority. "Let me guess. Consultant? Maybe finance?" "Victor," I chuckled. "Something like that." Maya smirked but didn't press further. He appreciated that. Just then, another flight attendant, an older man named Greg, came by. He was different from Monica and Lauren. His demeanor was warm, professional, and genuinely kind. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his gaze moving between them. "All good. Thanks," Maya replied. Victor nodded, but he noticed the way Greg's expression flickered for the briefest moment when he looked toward the galley where Monica and Lauren were standing. Something was off. Before Victor could dwell on it, a voice from a few rows back cut through the soft hum of conversation. "Excuse me, I've been waiting forever for a drink." Victor turned his head slightly. It was a middle-aged man in a tailored, gray suit. His tone was impatient, laced with entitlement. Lauren hurried over with an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry for the delay, sir. What can I get you?" "Whiskey." "Neat." The man huffed, barely looking at her. Lauren nodded quickly and disappeared toward the galley. But as she passed by Victor, he heard her mutter under her breath, "Some people just love to act like they own the place." Victor narrowed his eyes. Was she talking about the man in the suit? Or someone else? He glanced toward Monica, who was now whispering something to Lauren near the service station. They weren't being particularly discreet this time. He saw the small smirks, the way Monica glanced, again, toward his seat and Maya's. The tension in his chest coiled tighter. Victor turned his attention back to Maya, who had clearly caught the same thing. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head, before refocusing on her laptop screen. Minutes later, when Lauren returned with the whiskey, Victor noticed something else. Her energy was completely different. She was eager, overly accommodating. Too accommodating. The man in the gray suit, who had been rude moments ago, barely acknowledged her as she set the drink down. And yet, she gave him a beaming smile anyway. Victor had seen enough. He had come on this flight to observe, to get first-hand experience of what his passengers were going through. He hadn't expected to find exactly what he was looking for within the first hour. He took a slow sip of his champagne, his mind already racing through possibilities. This wasn't just about a single flight. It was about a culture, an attitude, a problem that ran deeper than corporate policies and training manuals. And the worst part? These women had no idea who he was. Victor had been underestimated before. He knew how to play the long game. But as he sat there, watching Monica and Lauren's quiet smirks, he realized something. Maybe this time, he wouldn't wait. Maybe this time, the reckoning would come mid-flight. But before he could settle on a plan, Greg, the kind flight attendant, approached him again, leaning in slightly. "Sir," he said in a quiet voice, "I think you should know. I overheard something in the galley, and it's not good." Victor's pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" Greg hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward Monica and Lauren. Then he turned back, his voice low and urgent. "They're talking about you." Victor's fingers tightened around the stem of his champagne glass, the bubbles fizzing unnoticed as Greg's words settled like a weight in his chest. "They're talking about you." He inhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. Greg hesitated, glancing once more toward the galley. His posture was tense, like a man deciding whether or not to step into a storm. "They think you're out of place." His voice dropped lower. "I heard Monica say something like, 'He doesn't look like the usual first-class type.' And Lauren laughed and said, 'Maybe he used someone else's miles.'" Victor set his glass down, his jaw tightening. It was worse than he thought. Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't want to overstep, but I've been flying for 20 years. I know the difference between a harmless joke and something else." He straightened slightly. "This is something else." Victor's mind raced, but outwardly, he remained composed. He had dealt with people like Monica and Lauren before. The kind who didn't have to say anything outright to make their feelings clear. The kind who smiled in your face while quietly ensuring you never felt comfortable. And the worst part? They were so sure they were untouchable. Greg sighed. "I don't know what your situation is, but if you need anything, let me know. I just thought you should be aware." Victor gave him a slight nod. "Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it." As Greg walked away, Victor exhaled slowly, his mind flashing back to a conversation from years ago. It had been after his first major pitch meeting, back when he was still proving himself in his father's company. He had spent weeks preparing, refining the presentation until it was perfect. But when the time came, the senior executives, older, white, dismissive, barely looked at him. They asked condescending questions, doubted his numbers, treated him like he was there as a courtesy rather than on merit. That night, he had called his father in frustration. "I did everything right, Dad. But they still looked at me like I didn't belong." Raymond Reynolds had been silent for a moment before saying, "You're looking for permission, son. Stop. You don't need it. But you belong where you decide. You belong. And the second they doubt you, that's when you stand taller. Because the moment you show them they're right, by shrinking, by questioning yourself, you've already lost." Victor ran a hand over his face, grounding himself in the memory. His father was right. He wasn't here to seek approval. He was here to see the truth. And now he had. Escalation in the air-an hour into the flight. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Monica and Lauren weren't overtly rude, but they weren't subtle either. When they refilled drinks, they skipped Victor's row more than once, forcing him to ask. When they checked on first-class passengers, they lingered at every seat, except his and Maya's. Victor wasn't the only one noticing. At one point, Maya gave him a knowing look and muttered, "I fly first class often. Never seen this much forgetfulness before." Victor smirked slightly. "Convenient, isn't it?" Maya shook her head, closing her laptop. "What are you going to do?" Victor exhaled. "I'm not sure yet." And that was the truth. Exposing the problem was easy. Fixing it? That required strategy. If he revealed who he was too soon, they would backpedal, claim it was all a misunderstanding. He needed more. Then, a new moment of hostility. When dinner was served, Lauren placed Maya's meal down with a polite, albeit cold, nod. But when she turned to Victor, she hesitated. "Sir, I just want to make sure. Did you request a special meal?" she asked, her tone just a bit too pointed. Victor raised an eyebrow. "No." "Why?" Lauren's smile was overly sweet. "Oh, I just assumed you might have different preferences." Maya made a sharp noise in her throat, but Victor beat her to it. "Just the regular meal is fine," he said coolly. Lauren's smile didn't waver, but there was something smug in her eyes as she placed the tray down. Maya leaned over as soon as Lauren walked away. "That was disgusting." Victor nodded, his patience wearing thin. He had seen enough. The unraveling Victor decided to act. He pressed the call button, and moments later, Monica arrived. She put on a well-practiced smile. "Yes, sir." Victor met her gaze steadily. "I'd like to speak with the purser." For the first time, Monica's expression faltered. "Oh, is there something I can assist with?" "I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge of the cabin," he repeated, his tone unwavering. Monica hesitated. She knew something was off, but she had no idea just how off. "Of course, sir," she said finally, turning stiffly. Minutes later, a senior flight attendant named Carla appeared. She was older, seasoned, with a no-nonsense air. "I understand you requested to speak with me." "Yes," Victor said. "There have been multiple incidents on this flight that I find concerning." He glanced meaningfully at Monica and Lauren, who were now hovering in the background, watching with unreadable expressions. Carla frowned. "Could you be more specific?" Victor folded his hands. "Microaggressions, deliberate oversight, and an overall pattern of behavior that suggests certain passengers are being treated differently." Carla's face tightened. She glanced at Monica and Lauren, who both remained silent. "I see," she said carefully. "I'll look into this." Victor nodded. "Please do." As Carla walked away, Monica and Lauren exchanged a glance. And then Lauren did something unexpected. She smirked. It was fleeting, gone in a second, but Victor caught it. He had just escalated the situation, but Lauren wasn't nervous. She was amused, as if she thought none of this would touch her. Victor exhaled, his pulse steady, his mind working through the implications. Then, another surprise. Greg returned, his face unreadable. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think there's something else you should know." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Greg hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's a passenger in business class, a frequent flyer. I overheard him talking to Monica earlier." Victor frowned. "And?" Greg's throat bobbed. "They were talking about you, but not just guessing who you are. They were laughing. And then the passenger said something that stuck with me." Victor's pulse quickened. "What did he say?" Greg's voice was barely above a whisper. He said, "Don't worry. Guys like that don't make it to the top." A slow silence stretched between them. Victor stared straight ahead, his heartbeat steady but heavy. He wasn't just being dismissed. He was being mocked. They didn't just assume he didn't belong. They believed he couldn't. A sharp, unexpected laugh escaped Maya. Wow! Wow! She turned to Victor, her voice low and incredulous. Are you sure you don't want to drop the CEO bomb yet? Victor smirked, but there was no humor in it. No, he murmured. Not yet. He had always been underestimated. Always. But what these flight attendants didn't realize, what none of them did, was that they weren't just dealing with another passenger. They were dealing with the man who could change everything. And he wasn't done watching. Not yet. Because something told him, this was only the beginning.